The desert heat pressed down on Camp Bradford like a heavy, invisible hand. It was late afternoon, that golden, dusty hour when the light turned every grain of sand into a shimmer. Inside the GP tent, a dozen Marines lounged on makeshift benches, sweating through their fatigues, killing time before the next patrol. Private Mason, barely 20, sat cross-legged near a fan that barely worked, tossing a pack of cards across the table to his buddy, Corporal Lewis. They were playing poker with bottle caps and bad jokes, their laughter bouncing off the khaki canvas walls. "Your face should be classified as enemy propaganda," Lewis quipped, grinning. "Huh. At least I'm pretty enough to distract the enemy," Mason shot back, and the tent erupted with laughter. Outside, a Humvee rattled by, kicking up dust. The men could hear the dull rhythm of helicopter blades somewhere far off, the war always present, always humming in the background, even in moments of supposed rest. Then, as if the air itself shifted, the tent flap opened. The laughter thinned, replaced by a brief silence. Standing at the entrance was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, and old. His hair, a mix of gray and white, caught the light in soft streaks. He wore a uniform that looked older than the men inside. Faded patches, sun-bleached edges, boots that had seen more than one war. He wasn't escorted. No one had announced him. He simply walked in. For a moment, everyone stared. The man's expression was calm, not stern, not timid, just quietly aware. His eyes moved across the room, sharp and knowing, as though he'd already taken stock of every Marine, every weapon, and every escape point. Then, without a word, he sat down on an empty ammo crate near the back corner. Mason smirked and nudged Lewis. "Well, look at that," he whispered. "Did we just recruit Grandpa?" A few Marines chuckled, the tension dissolving back into the easy rhythm of boredom. But the old man didn't react. He just unbuttoned the top of his jacket, took a slow sip from a dented canteen, and watched them with faint amusement. Corporal Lewis leaned forward, curious. "You lost, sir?" The med tents across the yard. The man looked up briefly. "No," he said simply, voice low, smooth, with that gravelly timbre that hinted at years of command. "I'm right where I meant to be." Mason laughed. "Right where you meant to be, huh? Well, this is the 3rd Recon's tent, old-timer. Unless you're looking to swap stories about the Korean War, you might be in the wrong place." A ripple of laughter followed. The old man smiled, not mockingly, not angrily. Just a slow, knowing curve of his lips. "I suppose that depends," he said, "on what kind of stories you tell here." The words hung in the air longer than expected. For reasons Mason couldn't quite explain, they landed heavier than they should have. He shrugged it off. "We tell Marine stories, real ones, about blood, sweat, and sand. You got any of those?" The man nodded. "A few." Lewis tried to lighten the moment. "All right then, Grandpa. Maybe start with your rank. You active, reserve, or just wandered in from a retirement home?" The tent laughed again, louder this time. Even Mason grinned wide. "Yeah, come on, old man. What's your rank?" But the man didn't answer right away. He just stared into the steam of his coffee mug, black, bitter, like a silence that began creeping back into the tent. Something about the way he held himself made Mason pause. The old man wasn't nervous. He wasn't defensive. He was just waiting, like a storm waiting to break. Finally, he lifted his gaze. His eyes, pale blue and sharp as cut glass, met Mason's directly. "Son," he said evenly, "if I told you my rank, you wouldn't believe me." That earned a snort from someone in the back. "Try us, old man," said Sergeant Vega, leaning against a crate with his arms folded. "We've heard it all." The man looked around slowly, studying the faces, the restless young soldiers, the mix of arrogance and weariness that came from living too long with sand in their boots and death in their periphery. Then he set the mug down, the metal clinking softly. "My name," he said finally, "is Hal Parker." The reaction was mild at first. Mason tilted his head, confused. The name sounded familiar, but didn't stick immediately. Then Lewis froze. His face went pale. "No way," he whispered. "General Parker?" The old man didn't answer. He didn't need to. The entire tent went dead silent. Even the hum of the fan seemed to die. Every Marine in that tent knew the name. General Hal Parker, the man who led the evacuation at Fallujah when everything went wrong. The one who went back into a burning compound to pull out wounded soldiers when the order was to retreat. The one whose photo hung in Marine barracks across the country, chest full of medals, eyes that told stories no medal ever could. Mason's throat went dry. He'd just called that man Grandpa. General Parker's face was calm. "Don't stop on my account," he said softly, glancing at the cards scattered across the table. "I've heard worse from privates with better hands." A few forced chuckles echoed weakly, but no one could meet his eyes. Mason swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't mean—" Parker waved him off gently. "Relax, son. I came here to talk, not to inspect. Carry on." But no one did. The game was forgotten. The laughter was gone. The air felt heavy, not from embarrassment, but from realization. The kind of realization that only comes when you suddenly recognize you're standing in the presence of something much greater than yourself. The old man leaned back against the crate, his expression unreadable. His hands, strong but weathered, rested calmly on his knees. Mason studied him quietly now, seeing what he hadn't noticed before: the faded scars on his knuckles, the slight limp in his left leg, the rows of campaign ribbons barely visible under the dust of travel. The man wasn't just old. He was living history. For a while, no one spoke. Then Sergeant Vega broke the silence. "Sir, permission to ask, what brings you here?" Parker looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Curiosity," he said. "Wanted to see what kind of Marines we're raising these days." Mason's stomach twisted with guilt. The general reached for his cap and set it neatly beside him. "Don't worry, son," he said, eyes settling on Mason. "Every Marine thinks he's invincible until life teaches him otherwise. You'll learn. That's what this uniform is for." Mason couldn't reply. The same voice that had sounded so harmless a moment ago now carried the full weight of a man who had led thousands into hell and brought many back alive. The tent remained silent for the next several minutes. Outside, the sound of a helicopter grew louder, circling the camp before fading into the horizon. Inside, 12 Marines sat frozen, unsure whether to apologize, salute, or simply listen. The old man didn't seem to need either. He just leaned back, took another sip of his coffee, and looked content to sit among them, not as a superior, but as one of their own. And somehow, that made the silence even heavier. By the time night settled, and the desert wind began rattling the tent flaps, Mason still couldn't shake the moment. He replayed the man's voice, the name, the calmness, all of it. He realized something important that night. Respect isn't earned by age or by medals. It's earned by presence. And General Hal Parker's presence had just reminded every Marine in that tent exactly what kind of legacy they stood under. The jokes were over. The lesson had just begun. The air inside the GP tent was thick, not from heat, but from the weight of realization. Every Marine sat frozen, as if time itself had stopped the moment those words left the old man's lips. Retired General Hal Parker. The name hung in the air like smoke, drifting, stinging, impossible to ignore. Private Mason's mouth went dry. He'd heard the stories, the legends passed down through barracks like sacred scripture. The hero of Fallujah. The man who never left a man behind. The ghost general. Those weren't myths anymore. They were sitting right in front of him, alive, calm, sipping bitter black coffee as though none of this mattered. No one dared move. Corporal Lewis swallowed hard. "General Parker, sir," he began, but his voice cracked halfway. Parker looked up, his pale blue eyes steady. "At ease, Corporal. You're off duty, aren't you?" The men blinked. His tone wasn't commanding, but it carried that quiet authority that didn't need to shout. The kind that came from years of being obeyed out of respect, not fear. Lewis nodded dumbly. "Yes, sir. Just, didn't expect to see an old man in your tent?" Parker interrupted with a half-smile. "You'd be surprised where old men wander, Corporal." A few forced chuckles escaped the room, but the tension didn't ease. Mason shifted in his seat, trying to look anywhere but the general. His mind replayed his own words. Who let Grandpa in? He wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. Sergeant Vega finally broke the awkward silence. "General, sir, we didn't mean any disrespect." Parker raised a hand. "If I got upset every time a young Marine shot his mouth off, I'd never have time to breathe." His voice softened. "Relax, you're soldiers, not saints." That drew a few nervous smiles, but still, the mood was heavy. The general looked around slowly, his eyes taking in each face, reading them like open pages. "How long have you boys been stationed here?" he asked. Vega answered first. 6 weeks, sir. Desert rotation. We're running supply escorts and recon along Route Phoenix." "Phoenix," Parker repeated quietly. "Rough road. Lost good men there." The tent went still again. Mason looked up, studying him. The general wasn't bragging. His words carried grief, the kind that never fades, just learns to hide behind routine. Parker noticed the silence and gave a faint smile. "Don't look so tense. I came to listen, not lecture." Lewis blinked. "Listen, sir?" "Yes," Parker said simply. "Every generation of Marines has its own voice. I wanted to hear yours." That caught Mason off guard. No officer had ever cared what they thought. "Well, sir," Vega said cautiously, "we mostly joke to get through the days." "It's how we keep sane." Parker nodded. "Laughter's good. Keeps men alive longer than bullets do." That earned a few genuine grins. Slowly, the tension began to melt. The men shifted, more comfortable now, though no one dared go back to playing cards. Mason decided he had to say something, anything, to redeem himself. "Sir, if I may, I really didn't mean to offend earlier." Parker turned his gaze toward him. It wasn't harsh, but it was penetrating. "Son," he said quietly, "a Marine's mouth is just another weapon. Sometimes it fires before you think. What matters is how you aim it next time." Mason nodded quickly, cheeks burning. "Yes, sir?" The general leaned back on the crate. "You remind me of myself once," he said, almost to himself. "Arrogant, reckless, loud, thought I knew everything. Then war came, and I realized I didn't know a damn thing." The tent was silent again, but this time not from fear, from fascination. "When you've seen enough," Parker continued, his tone low and reflective, "you stop shouting. You start listening. You learn that courage isn't about charging into fire. It's about standing still when everyone else runs." Lewis exchanged a glance with Vega. The general wasn't just talking, he was teaching. Every word felt like it carried the weight of 100 battles. Parker looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred, the veins raised like old roads on a map. "You boys ever lose someone close?" he asked softly. Vega nodded slowly. 2 men last year. eyed on patrol. The general's eyes softened. "I know that silence," he murmured. "The kind that hits after the explosion. The one that follows you long after the dust settles. That silence, it's what makes Marines different. You feel it, but you still get up. You keep moving." Mason's chest tightened. He thought of Anderson, his friend from boot camp, gone in the first month of deployment. He hadn't said his name out loud in months. The general looked up suddenly, catching Mason's expression. "Who'd you lose, son?" Mason hesitated. "Private Anderson, sir. My best friend, we shared the same bunk in Pendleton." Parker nodded slowly. "Then you know." The two men locked eyes, one young, one old, separated by decades, but bound by the same ghost. For the first time since he'd entered, the general's presence no longer felt intimidating. It felt human. He leaned forward slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "The world calls us heroes, but the truth is, heroes are just men who didn't die when they were supposed to. The rest of the time, we're just trying to live with what's left." No one spoke. The sound of the desert wind pushing against the canvas walls was the only noise. Then, after a long pause, Parker chuckled softly. "Now, enough gloom. Tell me something good. Who's the best shot in this tent?" That broke the heaviness instantly. Vega grinned. "Lewis thinks he is, sir. But we all know Mason's the only one who can hit a can at 50 yards. Parker raised an eyebrow. "That right?" Mason smiled nervously. "On a good day, sir." "Then maybe tomorrow we'll test that," the general said, eyes glinting. "Loser cleans the rifles for a week." The tent burst into laughter, genuine this time. Mason nodded, playing along. "You're on, sir. But fair warning, I don't lose easy." Parker gave a half-smile. "Neither do I." The tension was gone now, replaced by something else, respect. Real, earned respect. For the rest of the evening, the old man sat with them, listening to stories, laughing quietly at jokes, asking about home. He didn't talk about himself again. He didn't need to. His calm presence said more than any tale could. When night fell and the generator hummed to life, Parker stood up to leave. "Where are you staying, sir?" Vega asked. "Here," he replied simply, motioning to the small cot in the corner. "Figured I'd spend a night with the young blood." Mason blinked. "You're staying here? With us?" "Why not?" Parker said, setting down his cap. "A Marine's a Marine, no matter the years between him and the next fight." As the men settled in, Parker sat quietly at the edge of his cot, staring at the desert through the tent flap. His silhouette was still unmoving, like a statue carved out of memory. Mason couldn't sleep. He kept glancing over, wondering what kind of battles those eyes had seen, what kind of ghosts followed that man wherever he went. At some point during the night, he heard Parker murmur softly, almost like a prayer. "Stay safe, boys. All of you." Mason never forgot that moment, because for the first time since arriving at Camp Bradford, he understood something deeper than orders, deeper than bravado. The uniform wasn't just about strength. It was about carrying the weight of those who couldn't wear it anymore. And as he drifted into uneasy sleep, Mason realized that the old man hadn't come to impress them. He'd come to remind them who they were. Morning came slow and golden over Camp Bradford. The desert sun was merciless, already climbing high before the first bugle call sounded. The GP tent smelled of sweat, dust, and instant coffee, the usual perfume of Marine life. But today, something in the air felt different. Private Mason woke early, eyes gritty from a restless night. The memory of the previous evening kept replaying in his head, the moment the old man had said his name, the dead silence that followed, and the weight that had settled over every man in the tent. General Hal Parker. The name still echoed. Mason rubbed his face and glanced across the tent. The general was already awake, sitting cross-legged on his cot, reading what looked like a torn notebook. No insignia, no medals, no polished boots, just a quiet presence that somehow commanded more respect than any uniform ever could. "Morning, sir," Mason muttered, hesitantly. The general looked up, then nodded, his expression calm, but unreadable. "Morning, son." "You sleep?" "Barely," Mason admitted. Parker chuckled softly. "You'll get used to that. The desert doesn't like letting soldiers rest." Mason smiled weakly, unsure what to say next. He still felt the sting of embarrassment from yesterday. The fact that he had mocked this man, this legend, gnawed at him like sand in his boots. By breakfast, word had spread through the camp. The story moved faster than fire through dry brush. General Parker was here. Marines from nearby tents started showing up, pretending to borrow coffee or check supplies. But really, they just wanted a glimpse. The older NCOs looked stunned. Some even saluted quietly from a distance. Sergeant Vega, who'd served for 12 years, approached him respectfully. "Sir, it's an honor." "We didn't know. Not supposed to," Parker interrupted, folding his notebook. "I came here unannounced for a reason." Vega frowned slightly. "If I may ask, sir, why?" Parker's gaze shifted to the open tent flap, where the morning wind kicked up tiny whirlwinds of dust. "Because sometimes you learn more about a unit when they don't know they're being watched," he said quietly. "When they're just themselves." The men exchanged glances. They didn't quite know what to make of that. The general rose to his feet, stretching his stiff joints. Even in movement, there was discipline, the kind that never fades with age. "I spent years leading men," he said, "but leadership isn't about shouting orders. It's about understanding the people you lead, what makes them fight, what makes them freeze, and what makes them keep going when every instinct tells them to stop." The tent was quiet. No one dared interrupt. He looked around at them, young faces hardened by deployment, but still carrying that restless energy of men who hadn't yet seen enough to be truly haunted. "You all think you understand war," he continued, "but you don't. Not yet." Mason felt the words like a punch to the gut. The general paused, letting silence hang for a moment. Then, without warning, he asked, "Who here knows about the siege of Fallujah?" Lewis immediately straightened. "Everyone knows that story, sir. The rescue operation. 30 men surrounded, low ammo, heavy casualties." Parker's eyes flicked to him. "And what do they say about it?" "That you led the charge yourself," Lewis said. "They call it the bravest stand in Marine history." The general's expression didn't change. "That's what they say." He sat down slowly, the faint sound of his knees creaking. "The truth isn't as pretty." The men leaned forward instinctively. Even Vega, the seasoned sergeant, looked captivated. "We were supposed to fall back," Parker began. "Orders from command. But 3 of my men were still pinned down. I couldn't leave them." He took a breath, the memory clearly dragging him somewhere deep. "We went back in. Smoke, fire, bullets cutting through the walls like razors. When we found them, 1 was already gone. The other 2 were barely breathing. We dragged them out, inch by inch. Lost 2 more on the way." His voice faltered, not from weakness, but from weight. "By the time we made it to the extraction point, there were 5 of us left out of 32. Silence. The kind of silence that burns." Parker stared at the floor, his hands clasped. "They gave me medals after that. Called me a hero. But every medal feels heavy when you know whose name should have been engraved on it instead of yours." No one moved. No one even breathed. Mason felt something shift inside him. The image he'd had of war, Glory, bravery, action suddenly crumbled, replaced by something raw and human. Parker looked up again, his eyes sharper now. You boys joke to hide your fear. You talk big to convince yourselves you're ready. I get it. I did the same. But when you lose someone you die for, the jokes stop meaning much. Mason felt the words dig into him like blades. The general leaned forward slightly. Private Mason, wasn't it? Yes, sir, Mason said, his voice barely steady. You remind me of a kid named Harris, Parker said, staring past him, into memory. He was loud. Always talking, always laughing. The kind of kid who made everyone else forget how bad things were. We lost him in a blast outside Mosul. He smiled sadly. The day after, no one spoke for hours. Not because of orders, but because the laughter had died. It took weeks before anyone smiled again. The tent stayed still, every man listening as if afraid to miss a single word. Parker stood, walked toward the tent flap, and pulled it open slightly. The bright sun cut across his face, highlighting the deep lines carved by years of war. I came here to remind you, he said, that every name you wear on your chest, every patch, every rank, means something earned by someone who came before you. Someone who probably didn't make it back. Mason swallowed hard. His throat felt tight. The general turned back to face them. You think respect comes with rank. It doesn't. It comes from sacrifice. From silence. From the moments you choose to carry someone else's pain instead of your own. For a long while, no one spoke. Even the wind outside seemed to quiet. Finally, Parker gave a small nod. That's enough war talk for one morning. But Mason couldn't stay quiet. Sir, he said, hesitating, if you could go back, knowing what it would cost, would you do it again? Parker looked at him, eyes filled with that same steel-blue calm that had seen both hell and home. In a heartbeat, he said, because the only thing worse than losing them would have been leaving them behind. The answer hit like thunder. Lewis blinked, trying to steady his breathing. Vega simply nodded, jaw tight. The general's tone softened again. Don't misunderstand me, boys. War isn't about dying for your country. It's about making damn sure you live for it. He gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. Now, eat something before the sand takes your appetite. The men slowly began to move, grabbing trays and utensils, but the laughter didn't return. The jokes stayed buried. They weren't the same anymore. None of them were. Because after that morning, General Parker wasn't just a name to them. It was a reminder, a living, breathing embodiment of everything they had sworn to be and everything they feared to lose. As Mason watched him step outside into the blinding light, he realized something he'd never forget. The greatest soldiers aren't the ones who speak the loudest. They're the ones whose silence carries the weight of 100 fallen men. The desert was a cruel teacher. By noon, the heat shimmered like liquid fire across the horizon, and the air inside the camp felt heavy enough to choke on. The Marines of Delta Unit were used to it, or at least they liked to pretend they were. But after that morning's talk, something inside the tent had changed. The jokes had dried up. The noise had quieted. Every man went about his duties with a new kind of weight in his step, not fear, but reverence. General Hal Parker had disappeared after breakfast, saying only, I'll see you boys at the range. When Mason arrived there later, sweat soaking his undershirt, Parker was already waiting, standing near the firing line. Arms crossed, a faint smile playing across his weathered face. Thought I'd see who actually shows up when no one's giving orders, he said. Mason, Lewis, Vega, and 3 others lined up, rifles slung across their shoulders. Vega spoke first. Sir, with all due respect, are you planning on training us personally? Parker gave a half shrug. You could call it that. But it's not your aim I'm interested in. Mason frowned. Then what are we doing here, sir? Learning something they don't teach at boot camp, Parker said, his tone steady. Control. He gestured toward the sand dunes beyond the targets. Anyone can pull a trigger. Takes a soldier to know when not to. He motioned to Mason. You first, son. Mason stepped forward, adjusting his grip. The heat was brutal. The rifle's metal was scorching to the touch. He took aim at the far target, a thin wooden board with a white circle spray-painted on its center. Deep breath, Parker said quietly. Now let it out. Don't rush the shot. Let the shot come to you. Mason fired. The shot hit wide, splintering the board near the edge. He cursed under his breath. Damn wind, stop. Parker's voice cut clean through the air. Mason froze. Excuses, the old man said calmly, stepping closer. They're what you reach for when you're afraid of accountability. Try again. Mason adjusted, inhaled, and fired again. The bullet struck closer to the center. Not perfect, but better. Parker nodded slightly. Better. You're learning to listen. Not to me, to yourself. He turned toward the others. War isn't about speed. It's about precision. You hesitate, someone dies. You rush, someone dies. The art is in knowing the exact heartbeat between both. The Marines nodded silently, absorbing every word. For the next hour, Parker trained them one by one. He corrected stances, adjusted grips, and offered quiet advice that seemed simple, yet felt profound. His presence was steady, not commanding through volume, but through calm. Lewis, who usually treated training like a competition, noticed his own arrogance slipping away. Each correction from Parker felt less like criticism and more like wisdom, the kind that only comes from decades of surviving what others didn't. When they finally stopped, the sun was starting to dip, staining the sand a deep orange. Vega approached him, wiping his forehead. Sir, you could have retired with honors years ago. What brings you out here to train rookies? Parker smiled faintly. Retirement's for men who've put down their burdens. I still carry mine. Lewis tilted his head. You mean guilt, sir? The old man looked out at the horizon for a long moment before answering. No, responsibility. He turned back to them. The difference between guilt and responsibility is simple. Guilt keeps you stuck in the past. Responsibility pushes you to make the next generation better than you were. The words sank deep. After the range session, Parker invited them to the mess tent. By now, word of his impromptu training had spread through the base. Men whispered his name like a ghost story come to life. Some said he'd single-handedly saved 2 squads. Others said he'd once defied orders to protect civilians. Nobody knew what was true, and Parker didn't bother correcting them. He took a seat at the edge of the mess tent while the others lined up for chow. Mason sat across from him. Sir, can I ask something personal? Parker looked up from his coffee. You can ask. Whether I answer depends on the question. Mason hesitated. Why'd you never write a book? With everything you've seen, you could have inspired millions. Parker chuckled softly. Inspiration's overrated, son. Everyone wants to be inspired. No one wants to be changed. Mason blinked, unsure how to respond. The general leaned back in his chair. You write books. They turn your pain into entertainment. I'd rather teach a few who'll carry the lesson forward. Lewis joined them with his tray, curiosity burning in his eyes. So what lesson are you trying to teach us, sir? Parker stirred his coffee slowly. That rank isn't a title. It's a debt? A debt? Vega repeated. He nodded. Every stripe, every star, every commendation, they're reminders. You don't earn them by standing taller than others. You earn them by kneeling to help those who fall behind. The tent fell silent again, that same heavy silence that followed everything Parker said. He looked at Mason. You remember yesterday when you asked me my rank? Mason flushed red. Yes, sir. Parker smiled faintly. You weren't wrong to ask. You were wrong to assume it mattered. He leaned forward slightly. Out here, rank doesn't make you more important. It just makes you more accountable. The statement lingered like smoke. Later that night, as darkness swallowed the desert, Parker gathered the men outside near the perimeter. The wind had turned cool, and the stars burned bright above them, the kind of sight you only get in places where the world feels untouched. He picked up a handful of sand and let it fall slowly through his fingers. Do you see this? He asked. This sand doesn't care about rank, doesn't care about age or medals. It buries the proud and the humble the same way. No one spoke. But if you look closely, he continued, you'll see how each grain reflects light differently. That's what makes it beautiful. Same goes for soldiers. Every man here, different story, same purpose. That's what keeps a unit alive. He looked around the circle, his expression firm yet kind. The Marines don't need more heroes. They need men who remember what it costs to pretend to be one. It was the kind of lesson they'd never forget, one that didn't need textbooks or drills to sink in. When the group finally broke up, Mason stayed behind. Sir, he said quietly, you talk like someone who's seen everything. Does it ever stop haunting you? Parker didn't look at him right away. He just stared out into the endless dunes. No, he said finally, but it stops defining you when you learn to live for those who can't. Mason nodded slowly. The night was silent, except for the faint hum of generators in the distance. The general's voice softened. Tomorrow morning, we train again. But this time, you'll teach the others what you've learned. That's how we keep the light moving forward. As Mason turned to leave, Parker called after him. Private. Mason stopped. Sir? The old man smiled, faint but warm. You've got good instincts. Just don't let your mouth outrun your heart again. Mason grinned sheepishly. Yes, sir. Parker's eyes twinkled. Good. Then we'll make a Marine out of you yet. Mason walked back toward the tent, the sand crunching under his boots. He felt tired but alive, like the desert itself had stripped something away and left something better in its place. Behind him, the old man stood alone under the stars, hands clasped behind his back, eyes turned toward the heavens. To everyone else, he was a living legend. But to himself, he was just another soldier, trying to make peace with ghosts. It started as a whisper, a low rumble that barely stirred the sand beneath their boots. The kind of sound you'd mistake for the wind playing tricks on your ears. But within minutes, that whisper became a roar. By mid-afternoon, Camp Bradford was under siege, not from enemy fire, but from the desert itself. A sandstorm, massive and unrelenting, was barreling toward them from the west. The horizon darkened to a copper blur, swallowing the sun whole. The temperature dropped fast, and the air turned thick with grit. Everyone inside. Sergeant Viga's voice cut through the camp. Secure the tents. Tie everything down. Men scrambled to obey, shouting over the rising howl of the wind. Tarps flapped wildly, supply crates tumbled across the sand, and the air began to sting like 1,000 needles. Mason ran toward the communications post, trying to help a corporal tie down a radio antenna, but the gusts were brutal. The sand bit into his skin, filling his mouth and eyes. He could barely see 5 feet ahead. Forget it. The corporal yelled. It's gonna snap anyway. And it did, with a metallic scream that was lost in the storm's fury. Across the base, chaos reigned. That was when General Hal Parker emerged from his tent, calm as if walking through morning mist instead of a blinding wall of sand. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He just moved with purpose, coat whipping around him, eyes sharp as steel. "Viga!" he called, voice steady even against the wind. "Get your men inside the GP tent. Double-check every entrance flap. Use the inner ropes to secure them." "Yes, sir." Vega barked. Parker turned to Mason, who was still half blind from the dust. "Private, grab the first aid packs and bring them to the main tent." "Move." Mason didn't hesitate. "On it, sir." For the next hour, the storm punished them without mercy. The world outside turned to noise and motion, sand clawing at every surface, visibility reduced to nothing. The tent ropes strained against their stakes, and the ground trembled under the storm's rage. Inside, the GP tent became their refuge, a dim, flickering cocoon lit by lanterns. Men coughed, cursed, and tried to shake the sand from their uniforms. Mason dropped the med kits near the central table and looked to Parker, who was kneeling near the entrance flap, inspecting the seams like a craftsman checking his work. "Sir, it's holding," Vega reported. "But we lost communication with the motor pool." They were trying to secure the Humvees when it hit. Parker frowned. "How many?" "5 men, sir." The general didn't hesitate. "I'll go." Vega stepped forward immediately. "Sir, you can't. Visibility's 0. We'll lose you too." But Parker just gave that calm, unwavering look, the one that said the conversation was already over. "You'll hold the tent," he said firmly. "If this rope line fails, you'll have 30 seconds before it collapses. Keep everyone steady." Mason's heart pounded. "Sir, you can't go alone." The old man glanced at him. "Then don't let me." Without another word, Mason grabbed his scarf, wrapped it around his face, and followed Parker into the storm. The outside world was unrecognizable. The camp had vanished into an ocean of moving sand. Visibility was barely a few feet. Every breath was fire. Mason could only see the faint outline of Parker ahead, guided by the rope the old man had tied to the tent pole. They moved slowly, crouched low, following the line across the ground. The wind screamed so loud it drowned out thought itself. Halfway to the motor pool, they stumbled across a supply crate that had broken loose and slammed into a tent. Parker stopped, braced against it, and shouted something Mason couldn't hear. Then, a muffled voice through the sandstorm. "Over here." Mason turned, squinting into the orange haze. A faint beam of light flickered near a half-buried Humvee. They sprinted toward it, fighting against the wind like wading through a current. Inside the vehicle, 2 Marines were huddled together, one of them clutching his arm, blood seeping through his sleeve. The Humvee's side had been torn open by debris. "Stay low," Parker commanded, pulling open the back door. "We're getting you out, sir." One of the injured men gasped. The others, Jenkins and Ortiz, they're still at the far fence. Parker didn't hesitate. "Mason, get him back to the GP tent. I'll find the others." Mason shook his head violently. "Sir, it's suicide." The general met his eyes through the swirling grit. "Then let's make sure it's not in vain." He pressed the young Marine's shoulder once, steady, firm, then vanished into the storm. Mason's gut twisted. For a split second, he wanted to run after him. But he knew his orders. He lifted the wounded soldier over his shoulder and fought his way back toward the main tent. Every step felt like dragging a mountain. The rope line saved them. Barely. When Mason stumbled back into the tent, half the men rushed to help him. Vega's face went pale. "Where's the general?" "He went for the others," Mason panted. 2 still out there near the fence. Vega cursed under his breath. The next 20 minutes crawled like hours. The storm hammered the tent, ropes groaning, sand finding its way into every crack. The men huddled together, waiting for a shape, any sign of movement outside. Then a shadow appeared. Parker stumbled through the flap, dragging one Marine by the arm, the other slung over his shoulder. His uniform was shredded by sand and debris. His skin was bleeding in thin red lines. "Get them water," he said hoarsely, collapsing against the pole. "They're breathing." Vega and Mason rushed to help. "You went back for them," Mason said, awe in his voice. Parker looked up at him with tired eyes. "I told you, private leadership isn't about staying safe. It's about walking through hell first, so your men don't have to." Hours later, the storm finally began to die. The wind softened, and the sand settled into quiet dunes once again. The camp was wrecked, tents half buried, ears scattered everywhere. But everyone was alive. As the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, the Marines worked together to rebuild. Their faces were caked with dirt, but their eyes burned with something new, pride. Vega approached Parker, who sat near the medical tent, his arm bandaged, but his posture straight. "Sir," Vega said, voice low, "you saved them all. That was incredible." The general gave a weary smile. "No, Sergeant. They saved each other. I just reminded them they could." Nearby, Mason watched him quietly. The storm had stripped away any illusion he'd had left about what made a real soldier. It wasn't the rank, or the medals, or even the strength. It was the will to stand when others fall. Later that evening, when the camp had settled and the sky turned violet with dusk, Mason found Parker alone, fixing a torn section of his coat with a needle and thread. "You knew that storm would hit hard," Mason said softly. Parker nodded without looking up. "I've seen worse. The desert doesn't scare me anymore." "What does, sir?" The old man paused, forgetting what it cost to survive it. He tied off the last stitch, then met Mason's eyes. "You did good out there. You followed orders, but you also thought. That's rare." Mason felt his throat tighten. "I just didn't want to lose anyone." "That," Parker said quietly, "is the only kind of fear worth having." They sat in silence for a long moment, listening to the distant hum of generators. Finally, the general said, "Tomorrow, we'll talk about what comes after the storm, because surviving it is only half the battle." And as Mason looked out across the camp, battered, but alive, he understood what Parker meant. They had faced the desert and lived. But now came the harder part, learning how to carry the weight of it forward. The morning after the storm broke clear and cold, the desert horizon stretching endless and sharp under a pale blue sky. The camp looked wounded but alive. Half-buried tents stood like defiant scars against the dunes, and every man carried the exhaustion of those who had faced nature's fury and won. But in the aftermath, the camp also carried something else, a new sense of unity. They worked quietly, efficiently, rebuilding what the storm had torn apart. No one complained. No one slacked. It was as if the storm had stripped away their old selves and rebuilt them as one. And somewhere between the clatter of hammers and the crunch of boots in the sand, Mason realized how much of that was because of General Parker. The old man hadn't spoken much since the storm. He spent the morning moving from unit to unit, checking on the injured, helping repair supply shelters, giving quiet orders that carried the kind of authority that didn't need to shout. He didn't act like a general. He acted like one of them. When noon came, Vega approached him with a report. "Sir, supply check complete. We're missing one truck, the recon vehicle. It must have been carried off during the storm." Parker took the clipboard, scanning it. "Anyone checked the north perimeter yet?" "Not yet, sir," Vega said. "Still too unstable. The sand soft. Could sink half a wheel in a heartbeat." Parker nodded. "Then I'll take a look." "Sir," Vega started, "you should rest." "You haven't," Parker's gaze was calm, almost patient. "Sergeant, I've been resting since the last war. Let's go." Mason overheard and quickly fell in behind them, uninvited but not unwelcome. The three men set out toward the northern edge of the camp, where the dunes rose high like frozen waves. The sun was merciless, reflecting off the sand in blinding sheets. The air shimmered, and every step felt heavier than the last. Half a mile out, they found it, the recon truck, half buried nose first in the sand, its windshield cracked and its antenna bent. "Looks bad," Vega muttered. Parker knelt beside the vehicle, brushing sand off the hood. "Not beyond repair," he said. "But it's not the truck that worries me." Mason frowned. "Sir?" "Tracks," Parker said, pointing toward the distance. "Look there." In the sand, faint but clear, were tire marks, too narrow for marine vehicles. Civilian, maybe. Or something else. Vega crouched beside him. "Locals?" "Could be," Parker said. "Or smugglers." Either way, they were close. Too close. He stood, scanning the horizon through narrowed eyes. "You see, Sergeant, war isn't always fought with guns. Sometimes it's fought with silence, and the smart enemy knows how to use that." The words sent a chill through Mason's spine. They followed the tracks for another half-mile before Parker stopped abruptly. There, lying half-buried in the sand, was something metallic, small, rusted, and ugly. A detonator. Vega swore. IED components. Parker's jaw tightened. Looks like someone's been testing routes. Probably during the storm. Perfect cover. He glanced back toward the camp, eyes narrowing. They could have walked right up on us last night. Mason felt his stomach drop. "So what now, sir?" "Now we make sure they don't get another chance." Back at the camp, Parker wasted no time. He called Vega, Lewis, and 3 others to the central table inside the main tent. The lanterns flickered, shadows dancing across their faces. "Listen carefully," Parker began. "We're not going to wait for a report to crawl through the chain of command. We'll act fast, quiet, and smart. The tracks suggest a small convoy, maybe 3 vehicles, moving northwest toward the dry valley. If they were testing IEDs, that valley's where they'll hide their main stash." Vega nodded grimly. "You want us to move tonight?" Parker nodded. "After sundown. Just a recon. No engagement unless necessary. I'll lead the team myself." The words hit like a spark. Vega frowned immediately. "Sir, respectfully, you can't be serious. You're not supposed to—" "I'm not supposed to be here at all, Sergeant," Parker interrupted, voice firm but calm. "We've already crossed that bridge." Mason exchanged a look with Lewis. They both knew there was no arguing once the general made up his mind. 5 men, Parker said. "That's all we'll take." Speed and silence. Vega exhaled sharply, then nodded. "Understood." That night, as the camp fell quiet, the recon team gathered near the edge of the dunes. The sky was a vault of stars, the air cool and still. The storm had left behind a strange peace, the kind that made every noise feel amplified, every shadow alive. Parker moved with practiced precision, checking each rifle, adjusting straps, testing coms. The way he did it, slow, methodical, told everyone this wasn't his first night mission. "Keep radio chatter minimal," he said. "If we're lucky, we'll be ghosts. If not, we'll make the ghosts regret meeting us." Even in the darkness, Mason grinned faintly. The man's calm had a way of steadying everyone around him. They moved out. The desert stretched before them like a sea of black glass. Their boots left only faint prints. For hours, they advanced in silence, guided by moonlight and instinct. The world was reduced to the crunch of sand and the faint click of gear. At last, Vega raised a hand. Contact, he whispered, pointing ahead. In the valley below, faint lights flickered. 3 trucks, parked in a loose circle around a small campfire. Shadows moved between them. Parker crouched low, binoculars glinting. 6, maybe 8 men, he murmured. Not soldiers. Too casual. Smugglers, most likely. Lewis frowned. Then why the detonator? Parker's eyes narrowed. Because smugglers don't plant IEDs for profit. Someone's paying them. He lowered the binoculars and looked around the circle of his men. We're not here to start a firefight. We just confirm what we need and pull back. Got it? Copy that, Vega said. But the desert had its own plans. As they shifted positions along the ridge, Mason's boot dislodged a loose rock. It tumbled down the slope, bouncing off stone, loud, too loud. Below, one of the men by the fire snapped his head up. Shouts echoed in a language Mason didn't recognize. Down, Parker hissed. Gunfire erupted, bright flashes tearing through the dark. Bullets hissed through the sand like angry hornets. Flank left, Parker ordered, rolling behind a dune. Mason, cover Vega? Mason returned fire, adrenaline surging. He could barely see, only flashes of movement. Vega fired short bursts, pinning down 2 of the attackers. Then Parker moved, fast, fearless, circling wide to draw their attention. His silhouette moved through the dust like a phantom. Lewis's voice came through the radio, strained. Sir, 2 vehicles starting up. They're making a break for it. Let them, Parker replied. We've got what we came for. He lobbed a flashbang toward the fire, and in the blinding light, the surviving men scattered. Within minutes, the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. When it was over, they regrouped at the ridge. Mason's hands shook as he reloaded. Sir, Vega said, breathing hard, we should have been torn apart down there. That was too close. Parker just gave a faint smile. Close keeps you alive, Sergeant. Overconfidence gets you buried. He bent down, picking something out of the sand. A patch, half burned but legible. Mason leaned closer to read it. The insignia wasn't local. It was U.S. military, but not Marine. Army. Sir? Mason began slowly. Does this mean... Parker's expression darkened. It means this isn't just smugglers. Someone's feeding them equipment. Someone who knows our roots. The air grew heavy. He tucked the patch into his vest pocket. We'll take this back. But not a word about it yet. Not until I know who we're really dealing with. As they made their way back toward camp, the first faint light of dawn brushed the dunes. Mason fell in step beside the general. Sir, he said quietly, why do you keep doing this? You've earned your peace. Parker's eyes stayed on the horizon. Because peace isn't something you earn, son. It's something you protect, even when no one else remembers why. The words hung in the morning air, quiet, powerful, and true. The wind howled across Camp Bradford that night, like a living thing. Fine sand hissed against the tents, finding its way through every tiny seam and zipper. Inside the GP tent, lanterns swung slightly, casting long, jittery shadows across the faces of the Marines gathered around a dented steel table. Private Mason sat quietly, turning his canteen cap between his fingers. His gaze was fixed on the flickering light, but his thoughts were far away. Across from him, Sergeant Vega checked the radio again, his face tense. There had been whispers all day, enemy movement in the dunes, radio chatter intercepts, a possible ambush being planned against one of the convoy routes. But as the night deepened, those whispers began to sound less like rumors and more like warnings. General Parker was there too, sitting in the corner of the tent, perfectly still. He had that same calm, unreadable look, The kind that could either mean everything's under control or everything's about to go to hell. Mason finally broke the silence. "Sir," he said softly, "you think they'll come tonight?" Parker didn't answer right away. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "They'll come when they think you're not ready," he said finally. "That's how the smart ones fight." Lewis, who had been trying to look brave, chuckled nervously. "Well, joke's on them. I haven't been ready since we got here." A few of the men laughed quietly, but it was hollow. The tension in the tent was like static electricity, waiting for one spark to ignite. Then came the first boom. A deep, distant thud rolled across the desert, followed by another, closer this time. The tent poles rattled. Vega grabbed the radio. "Command, this is Delta Tent. Do you copy?" Static. "Command, confirm. Are we under indirect fire?" Another explosion. This one so close the ground seemed to jump. Mason's canteen hit the floor, and the lantern flickered violently. Parker stood, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Everyone stay low. Veda, get a sitrep. Lewis, Mason, grab your gear. Move, no hesitation." The Marines scrambled to obey. Outside, the night had turned orange. Tracer rounds zipped through the dark sky like fiery arrows. The distant sound of machine gun fire echoed against the dunes. Mason's heart hammered as he clipped on his vest. "Sir, stay with me," Parker barked. They pushed through the tent flaps and into the storm of chaos. The camp was a blur of shouting, lights, and dust. Sirens wailed. Somewhere near the motor pool, a Humvee was burning, its tires melting into black smoke. Vega ran up beside them. "Mortar from the west ridge, sir." "We're trying to triangulate, but—" "Forget triangulation," Parker snapped. "Get those men to cover. I'll handle the ridge." Vega hesitated. "Sir, you're—" "I said move, Sergeant." There was no arguing with that tone. Vega sprinted off, rallying his team. Parker turned to Mason and Lewis. "You two with me." Mason's throat went dry. "With you, sir? To the ridge?" Parker looked at him with that cold steel stare. "You think the rank means I stay behind?" That was all he needed to hear. Mason nodded. "Yes, sir." They moved fast, ducking behind vehicles and sand barriers. The air was thick with grit and the smell of burning fuel. Mortar blasts shook the earth behind them, each one closer than the last. When they reached the west perimeter, the night erupted again. A mortar hit 30 yards to their left, throwing a wave of sand and shrapnel. Mason hit the ground hard, ears ringing. He could taste dirt in his mouth. Parker grabbed his arm and pulled him up. "You good, son?" "Why, yeah," Mason coughed. "Then let's finish this." They crawled up the ridge, using the moonlight and chaos as cover. The sound of enemy fire crackled in the distance. Parker's eyes never stopped scanning the horizon. He moved with a quiet precision it seemed impossible for a man his age, like muscle memory built from decades of surviving hell. Finally, they spotted it. The flash of a mortar tube being reloaded, maybe 400 yards out, half hidden behind a sand crest. Lewis whispered, "There, 2, maybe 3 of them." Parker gave a slow nod. "Lewis, take the left flank. Mason, stay low with me. Wait for my signal." Mason's pulse raced as he crouched in the sand. The desert wind cut across his face, cold and sharp. He watched Parker, steady hands, eyes fixed on the enemy. The old man wasn't shaking, wasn't even breathing heavy. When Parker raised 2 fingers, Mason's grip tightened on his rifle. "This is it," he thought. "This is real." The old general whispered, "Now." In a burst of motion, Lewis broke left, drawing their attention. Gunfire erupted. Parker rose to one knee, sighted down his rifle, and fired, one shot, clean and perfect. The first enemy dropped instantly. The others scrambled, shouting. Mason fired next, his bullets kicking up plumes of sand. Another target fell. Parker advanced 10 yards ahead, too far. Mason thought, but the general moved like a man who had done this 1,000 times before. A final mortar blast went off behind them, shaking the ridge, but by the time the smoke cleared, the firing had stopped. Parker stood still, scanning the bodies through the dust. Silence. Only the echo of gunfire remained in the distance. Lewis limped back toward them, breathing hard. "All down, sir." "We got him." Parker nodded once. "Good work." Mason exhaled shakily, his entire body trembling. "Sir? You just saved the whole camp." The old man didn't answer right away. He knelt beside the nearest body, turning it over. A young man, barely 20, stared back, lifeless eyes open to the sky. Parker's jaw tightened. "They always look too young," he muttered. Then, almost to himself, "Doesn't matter what side they're on." Lewis and Mason exchanged a glance. The general stood, brushing sand from his uniform. "Let's go home, boys." By the time they got back, dawn was breaking. The camp was in ruins. Burned vehicles, cratered ground, debris everywhere. But the attack had stopped. The ridge was silent. Vega ran up to meet them. "Sir, we just got confirmation. Mortar silenced, minimal casualties." "You did it?" Parker didn't smile. "We did it," he said. Every man who stood his ground tonight earned that sunrise. As the first light of morning broke over the dunes, the Marines stood together, exhausted but alive. For a long while, no one spoke. The desert was still again, quiet, golden, indifferent. Then Parker looked at Mason. "You asked me once if I'd do it again," he said. "Now you know why I said yes." Mason nodded, tears stinging his eyes. He couldn't speak. The general turned his gaze toward the horizon. "War teaches you a cruel truth, son. You don't fight because you hate what's in front of you. You fight because you love what's behind you." And as the sun rose over Camp Bradford, painting the battered tents in light, Mason understood, truly understood, what those words meant. Because that night, under the falling sky, he had watched an old soldier become young again. And a tent full of Marines finally learned the meaning of courage. The desert was eerily quiet the morning after the battle. The chaos of the night before had left behind blackened craters, twisted metal, and the faint smell of gunpowder still lingering in the air. The sun rose heavy and red, painting everything in the same color, the color of survival. Inside the GP tent, the Marines moved slowly, bandaging scrapes, packing gear, checking weapons. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. The silence said everything. Private Mason sat on his cot, his hands still trembling slightly as he cleaned his rifle. Every time he blinked, he saw flashes of last night, the explosions, the screams, the fire, and through it all, the calm, steady figure of General Parker moving through the smoke like he'd done it all before. Sergeant Vega entered the tent, his uniform streaked with sand. "Command wants a full debrief at 0900, he said. "They're sending evac for the wounded." Lewis looked up. "What about the general?" Vega hesitated. "He's with the CO. Apparently, they didn't even know he was here till last night." Mason's head shot up. "What? He didn't tell them?" Vega gave a small, almost proud smile. "Guess he didn't need to. After what happened, the entire base knows who he is now." Outside, Parker stood alone near the burned-out motor pool, staring across the dunes. His hat was off, his silver hair stirring in the dry wind. The camp was buzzing behind him. Medics, mechanics, officers, all talking in low voices, but he stood apart, like a monument carved out of silence. The CO, Major Henderson, approached slowly. "Sir," he began, his tone carrying the weight of deep respect. "We've confirmed the ridge is clear. Enemy retreated before dawn. You saved us." Parker didn't look at him. "The boys saved themselves. I just reminded them what they were capable of." Henderson nodded. "Still, command's asking for a report. They want to know what you are doing here, sir." Unannounced. Finally, the general turned, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Tell them I was visiting ghosts." Henderson blinked, unsure what to say. Parker continued, voice low. "I've seen too many bases, Major. Too many tents just like this one. I wanted to see if the next generation still had what it takes. After last night," he paused, looking back at the camp, "I got my answer." Henderson swallowed hard. "Understood, sir. And for what it's worth, it's been honor." Parker nodded, then extended his hand. "The honor's mine, Major. Keep them sharp. They'll need it." Back at the tent, Mason was tightening his boots when he heard a voice from behind him. "Still making that coffee too strong, Private?" He spun around and saw Parker standing there, smiling faintly. "Sir," Mason jumped up, nearly knocking over his canteen. "I didn't know you were—" "Relax, son," Parker chuckled. "I'm not here for inspection." The old man sat down across from him, his movements slower now, like the night had drained something deep from him. He poured himself a small tin cup of coffee and took a sip. "Still terrible," he muttered, grinning slightly. Mason smiled back. But then the question that had been sitting heavy on his heart pushed its way out. "Sir, are you leaving?" Parker didn't answer right away. He set the cup down, looking at it like it held all the memories of his life. "Yes, I am. My work here's done." Mason felt something twist in his chest. "You can't just go, sir. After everything you taught us?" Parker raised a hand gently. "That's exactly why I can go. Because now you don't need me." The tent fell quiet again. Outside, the morning wind rattled the canvas, whispering through the seams. Lewis walked in then, stopping short when he saw Parker. "Sir," he said, straightening, "we just wanted to thank you. For last night. For everything." Parker's eyes softened. "You don't thank an old soldier for doing what he was trained to do. You just remember the lesson." He stood slowly, looking at both of them. "You boys learned what no classroom or manual can teach. That courage isn't about not feeling fear. It's about walking forward anyway, even when your hands shake." Mason swallowed hard. "Sir, what happens now? Where will you go?" The general smiled faintly. "Home, maybe. Or maybe just somewhere quiet enough to hear myself think again." Then he looked at them, really looked, the way a father might look at sons he's proud of, but knows he'll never see again. "You remind me of the ones I lost," he said quietly. "That's the best compliment I can give you." When the time came, the entire camp gathered near the landing zone. The air hummed with the sound of helicopter blades approaching. Every Marine stood at attention, boots lined perfectly in the sand. Even the wounded, those who could stand, came to see him off. General Parker walked slowly through their ranks, his hat tucked under one arm, his expression calm. No medals, no speeches, no fanfare, just a man saying goodbye. When he passed Mason, he stopped. "Private," he said. Mason straightened instinctively. "Sir?" Parker extended his hand. Mason took it, feeling the strength in that weathered grip, the weight of every battle, every command, every loss carried in those calloused fingers. "Keep them laughing," Parker said softly. "You remind me of a man who used to do that for me." Mason blinked hard, fighting the sting behind his eyes. "Yes, sir." The general smiled, then turned to the others. "You boys did good. Don't ever forget that." Then, without another word, he turned toward the chopper. As the blades kicked up sand, the Marines raised their hands in salute. The wind roared, whipping at their faces, but no one moved. No one blinked. Parker climbed aboard slowly, turned once to look at them, a sea of young faces standing in perfect formation, and gave a single nod. The chopper lifted off, rising higher into the burning desert sky. Mason watched until it was nothing more than a speck against the sun. Only then did he lower his hand. That night, the camp was quiet again. No mortar, no shouting, just the sound of the wind whispering through the dunes. Mason sat by the tent, staring up at the stars. Lewis joined him, dropping down beside him with a sigh. "You think we'll ever see him again?" Lewis asked. Mason shook his head slowly. "Maybe not, but I don't think he ever really left." Lewis frowned. "What do you mean?" Mason looked out toward the horizon, where the sky met the sand. "He's in all of this," he said softly. "Every time we don't give up. Every time we watch each other's backs. That's him." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mason added, almost in a whisper, "You know, I joked about his rank once. Thought he was just some old guy with stories. Turns out he was the story." Lewis smiled faintly. "Guess you learned something, huh?" "Yeah," Mason said quietly, his gaze fixed on the dark horizon. "I learned that rank doesn't make a man respected. The way he carries it does." The desert wind blew softly, carrying the faint echo of rotor blades that weren't there anymore, or maybe were, somewhere far away. Mason stood, brushed off the sand, and looked toward the dawn that was beginning to break. "Rest easy, General," he whispered. "We'll take it from here." And as the first light spread across the dunes of Camp Bradford, the story of General Hal Parker became more than just a memory. It became a legend, told around campfires, whispered in tents, and passed from one generation of Marines to the next. A story that began with a joke and ended with silence. Because sometimes the loudest thing a soldier can leave behind is the echo of respect.